Hi guys, welcome to another video on History School Online. Today we're looking at the Edexcel option 1E, Russia 1917 to 91 from Lenin to Yeltsin. In the second theme that runs through this topic, there is the economy and looking at how the economy developed through the years. And I've picked the first section of that really and merged parts of it together. It has been quite a popular topic between some of my students that I've been helping this year, and you know economic understanding isn't necessarily expected between A-level students unless you're studying it separately. So hopefully this video will help give some understanding to some terms, to some sort of questions you may be having as you're going through revising yourself. Any questions, anything you want to throw at me, leave in the comments below. Happy to answer anything. And really, the aims for this, my hopes with sharing this with you, is that we're going to understand Lenin's policies in trying to change the economic system in Russia to start with, understand then what Stalin did to take it further, and then just sort of have a think about whether the planned economy and the command economy really did work for the Soviet Union. Of course, we're only looking at this up to 1941, so barely halfway through the period that you'd be studying. So there will be a second video looking at the second half of this. But to merge these together, it really helps understand the differences and also some of the similarities in the way these economies were planned. We'll also go through the pros and cons, and that's really where the analysis can be drawn in there to try and understand actually how well did these policies work for Russia and the Soviet Union. So starting with Lenin's economic plans, to understand really why people or why leaders would want to change economics, apart from the fact that in 1917 the Bolsheviks take over and it's just a completely new system of governance with a completely new ideology. You also have to understand demographics, or actually what is happening within the country at the time. Russia in 1917 and beforehand was in serious economic problems. They had begun to start industrializing, but were still massively far behind more developed Western countries, the UK, France, the US, countries like that, countries that had already been through an industrial revolution. Their labour force was mostly made up of peasants, the peasantry working in the fields, and was largely an agrarian economy. Now, this does also need to take into account World War One. At this point, the serious economic problems come from massive expenditure in fighting World War One, and one of Lenin's first policies is to withdraw Russia from that conflict. So he starts off favourably with a very welcome policy amongst the population, and then starts setting about actually changing economics. His vision was that a socialist economy would be very efficient. Uh, he believed that the economy had to be managed and shouldn't be left to free market capitalism. It would help workers be free from capitalism and from the tendencies that brought, the greed, and that they would be better paid and treated better because they could plan that in. His economic policies reflected his faith in pure expertise, the sheer desire for efficiency, and the discipline of the workers. That's something that continues throughout, and it's something that you really see from Lenin's policies. That it's something he was quite adamant with, and we'll look into that further now. So looking purely at Lenin's policies, we're not going to go through the background behind them too much, just going to look through what they were, the results of them, look at then at the end of the period, whether they were successful or not. I would imagine that as a minimum, you've gone through some of this stuff in your course generally anyway. If there are any questions around more specifics, then, ask away in the comments, but we're just going to look at the high level information of these economic policies, just as an addition to what you may have already learned. So really under Lenin's direction, there were only a couple of policies in the time that he was alive in this period. The first being war communism. As a policy, it's a nice name, but all it essentially means is that he directed the economy to be fully efficient, or as efficient as it could be during the Civil War. So all we're looking at here really is high levels of industrial output of war goods, an efficient allocation of resources, food production to feed soldiers, workers, and civilian population. That's the sort of economy that most countries put into action in times of war. The difference being here is that it was a civil war, and actually this was put in place, bearing in mind that the Bolsheviks only really controlled a few key cities and really a very small populace and area of Russia during this war. But they were able to use their control over the economy to help them win it. Again, similar to how other countries have directed their economies during periods of wartime, they just fought externally with foreign powers. The results of this were that through efficient use of economic systems, they're able to keep their army supplied, the Red Army eventually winning the war. But the downside to this, and another outcome usually of direction of an economy totally towards war, is at the end of that war, there generally tends to be an economic collapse, a market collapse. But we haven't quite got to the period here where we're looking at pure socialist planned economy. Markets collapse, and it brings mass poverty to the peasantry and to the population in Russia. So keeping the army supplied, ammunition and transport during a war is essential. However, when you then get to post-war periods, all that effort and direction you've put in towards the war is no longer needed, and it's either difficult to go back to how you were working beforehand, or it's difficult then to, keep these workers that have now been trained working in factories to produce things that aren't needed anymore, especially with a country that's as introverted or as isolationist as Russia and the Soviet Union becomes during this period. Following war of communism and the need for it actually disappearing after the Civil War, Lenin introduced a new economic policy. This was an attempt to revive the economy and realistically stop political defeat within the Politburo. Bearing in mind that the way that the party was structured, actually the need to survive at the top echelons of the party was just as important as actually helping the country. So a policy was needed to stimulate grain production, to end famine and starvation, and really there was an argument that the Communist Party had to learn to be able to trade and use capitalism in order to then build communism as an end goal. Actually, what it turned out to be is a sort of toe in the water attempt at a form of capitalist economy without going the whole way and still holding some sort of control. It's also pushing an economic system that the Soviets aren't necessarily used to. So on the one hand, you have political and economic stability because a free market economy can fluctuate naturally, but it generally balances itself out. It's based on the principle of supply and demand. Also, people working in farms were actually allowed to produce surplus amounts of grain, so they didn't have to build a farm to quotas anymore. They could actually produce more than was needed and then sell the excess, allowing them to either live a little bit more comfortably or just to continue feeding their family, buying other essentials rather than living hand to mouth. It produced a new class of people called the netmen, and these really were just middlemen between the agrarian farmers and people ultimately wanting to buy their products. They were just middlemen salesmen buying from one, selling to another, and it kind of encapsulates that capitalist tendency that comes out of a free market economy, opportunity to make money and to profit. Ultimately, though, the policy led to what is known as the scissors crisis. This is ultimately one of the outcomes when supply and demand don't quite work the way they should because some control is being held or things aren't developing the way they should. So the scissors crisis is basically just a way is named as such because of the way it would look on a graph or in a table, that as the demand for expensive agricultural goods, just say, increases, when there is a lack of supply, the price also increases, and that's supply versus demand. Similarly, with all the extra grain that's being produced, it floods the market with supply of grain, its value massively decreases. So you have this scissor crisis really, where you have agricultural farmers needing to purchase new equipment in order to be more efficient in the way they're farming, but actually there's so few things being built that they're massively expensive. Also, with the amount that they are producing, their crop at the moment is worth less and less for the time and effort they put into it. So they're actually not earning enough to be able to buy these new machinery and things like that, things that are going to make their lives more efficient. So actually the government steps in here and helps to subsidize purchasing these things. And what that really shows is it proves that the system is ineffective, because if it was purely left to free market economics, it should balance itself out. It shouldn't need intervention of any sort of great scale. But also, if the country was really developing, companies would be able to produce more factories, or build more factories to be able to produce more goods to meet the demand of the farmers or of other people looking to buy industrial goods, consumer goods. So the intervention of the government to subsidise shows that actually, although there was general happiness with the way the system was implemented and working, especially amongst the higher powers in the Politburo, it actually wasn't a system that could really progress without, again, nudges and government getting involved when things did struggle. And that led to what was known as the Great Industrialization debate, which became central to the leadership struggle after Lenin's death. Up to 1928, Lenin's policies had been reactive, not very well planned, and also after his death, the NEP continued and bumbled along, actually no progression, no input with a leaderless government. It, as I mentioned before, proved to be an ineffective system, something that needed to be changed. And given the leadership struggle and Stalin's shift to the left, with the leftist Politburo members believing that change being necessary and the NEP should be abolished, we see change, the thought being that change was needed to push the economy forwards. So we progress into Stalin's economy and the beginnings of a real command economy. Again, this is up to 1941, so some of the conclusions we draw may not be similar to what you expect at the end of the period or at the time of Stalin's death, but up to 1941 especially, this is going to be important. So we have the introduction of 5-year plans. The main objectives of these plans is to industrialize Russia, to set massively ambitious goals, catching up with the West, and, as we mentioned before, to eliminate net men and the NEP in general. There were a number of problems with the 5-year plans. I'm not going to go into all of them, similar for Lenin's things there. I would expect that you've covered 5-year plans through your studies. The problems with the plan were that they were simply a list of targets, had nothing to do with how the economy should function or could function in order to create a strong economy, and actually ended up being used just as a propaganda campaign to achieve a set of targets set by Stalin and to help the personality cult that was surrounding him, or that he had begun to surround himself with. That isn't to say that everything was failure, that the 5-year plans didn't make anything useful for the Soviet Union, so we shouldn't get bogged down in looking at just pure negatives. There were some really big successes, and success stories include things like heavy industry, transport, labour productivity and rearmament. Again, not going into all of them, but when you look particularly at heavy industry, what you're seeing is actually raw materials being pulled out of the ground to mass numbers to hit targets. When a country is as agrarian based and is going through, say, its initial industrial revolution or industrialization, really what you're seeing here is the use of natural resources to set a footing, and then to hopefully use those to produce consumer goods or to produce more efficient machinery and tools to be able to push on that industrialization to the next step, which would help with producing more efficient systems, but also better consumer goods, things that are really going to make the economy continue to work and more efficiently, and things that are produced rather than things that are dug out the ground. But because we're looking here at a beginning system and the beginning of industrialization, heavy industry is massively successful because it's the first place where you look to make progress. Transport also, because you have to be able to move these things around once you've dug coal, once you've mined, once you've pulled oil out of the ground, and once natural gas is discovered and it has to be piped to places, transport links massively increase. That also includes in Moscow with the new metro lines, and that helps to build a city up because the trains can now get to places quicker. People can live slightly further away from where they needed to, but still get to places quickly. Productivity increasing is down mostly to the increase in heavy industry and the pure number of people that are needed to build that really quickly. And similarly with rearmament, increase in factories and the amounts of munitions and weaponry that could be created. One thing that's always certain in the economy is that war and munitions and war materials and goods will always make a country money, will always make an economy thrive. There's always people that want to buy them. War always makes money. As much as it destroys an economy and fighting a war, selling weaponry and having that stockpiled is usually helpful and usually good for a developing economy. Again, that being said, when we look at the negatives of that, actually putting things like steel into munitions and weaponry production, the production of steel wasn't to a good enough quality to really make those munitions effective or efficient. Purely trying to hit targets when pulling iron and coal from the ground and then using that to make steel actually wasn't done with sufficient technological knowledge to make the good quality steel, and actually hindered the quality, which is a theme that we'll see throughout when we look at issues with the 5-year plans. Production quality was not a thing that the Soviet Union was worried about. It was purely hitting targets. So the plans set targets for production. We weren't looking at quality at all. It was purely just hit this number with this amount of goods by this time. It almost doesn't matter, whether that car is made out of wood and planks, whether it is made out of the proper materials. It didn't matter. Large quantities is purely the name of the game. There's also no coordination for planned output, which means that materials are wasted. Multiple factories built in similar places with similar materials could coordinate how they use those materials and the quantities of them needed to produce quality output. However, that wasn't important, so whatever was available was used. And then the really bizarre part of this is that there was no planned demand for these things. A lot of these things produced weren't planned to be sold, weren't planned to be given away even. They simply were built, made, created, put together, and were then left to rot in warehouses. They never saw the light of day after they were built, and it didn't matter because as long as targets were hit, that's all that was needed. 40% of what was produced was wasted in similar ways to things like that. And then also Stalin purged economic planners that really would have been able to help progress economic development purely on the basis that Stalin wanted to plan the economy himself. And it actually didn't matter that there were other ways of making the economy work. It was purely, this is how it's going to work, sort of mentality. So I get that we've probably rushed through that quite quickly. I hope you can maybe go back through, pause, replay some parts of this video. I am conscious of the fact that even though I feel like I've rushed through it, it's still quite long. We're getting to the conclusion now of this section, which is just looking at the period up to 1941. A really simple conclusion, but something to think about nonetheless. Despite everything that you kind of learn, the time you put into learning the period 1917 to 28, Lenin's economic vision never actually got to play itself out fully, and although successors attempt to be Leninist to win votes and favour, actually the Lenin style of economy, as he would have set it out himself, never really got to play out properly. His policies were reactive, and they didn't and really couldn't have led to a strong Soviet economy anyway. And actually, when Stalin came to power, he was able to transform the economy through a period of massive industrialization with the 5-year plans. The drawback to that is that that was massively wasteful, and actually the means didn't justify the ends. Purely when you look at it in hindsight, you kind of see that the lack of future thinking actually ended up or could jeopardize the planned economic model, because once you get past each of these 5-year plans, there's just no future sight into how, when you get to that next stage, how do you build on that to actually move the economy forward? Continual industrialization forever is never going to work, and actually planning that a bit better and being more efficient with what was produced and how it was produced and what happened once it was produced could have actually led to a better use of the system. It just didn't materialize that way. So in the next video that I'm going to put up, which will cover a period post 1941 up until at least the period of Stalin's death, and maybe even to the end of Khrushchev's reign of power, we'll be looking at World War II, how that has to be considered when we're looking at economics in the Soviet Union, the Cold War, because we can never just look internally, we have to look externally as well. What was going on in the world that may have caused policies to be the way they were. Also looking at other foreign policies and proxy wars in the Middle East and in Asia, and the venture into Afghanistan. So we're not purely looking just up to the end of Khrushchev, but further than that, in the 70s, the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, and also to a slightly lesser extent, Comecon, the reaction of that to martial aid and things like that. So I hope you found it helpful. Again, the next video will be looking at how we can improve our economic understanding and to use hindsight with care when we look back at this period and economics especially. One thing that I do want to highlight is when you're looking at this period and this topic through to your exam periods, remember that the period that Lenin was in power was actually so short that it's not something you're going to be asked about directly in and of itself. The period that you have to cover will be about 30 years, and if a question comes up around anything to do with Lenin's form of government and economics, it's going to be mainly looking at the differences and the continuation, successes, compare and contrast with Stalin's government. Also, looking at it that way, we also need to make sure that we understand the period up to 1928 to really get a feel for why Stalin did what he did, how he was able to do what he did, and the economy moving forwards. So like we started at the start of this video, you have to understand where we were to understand how we got to where we go. I hope that makes sense. Any questions that you do have, drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. The next video will be coming on Tuesday next week, so hopefully that'll be useful to you. And again, any questions in the meantime, do let me know. Thanks for watching.